Welcome back, everybody. Actually, I hope you enjoyed your lunch and you have the fuel to be with us for the next session. This is Conversation 3, titled Innovation, Curating Contexts. Now, it's interesting. We played with the idea of where should innovation be in our program. It was taken up in our last panel and the panel prior, so it's interesting how it's kind of floating across, and some people have issues with the idea of innovation, others don't. In this case, we are thinking a lot about the idea of locality and what context means, and thinking about curatorial practices that don't necessarily look to adorn a locality, but to animate its social, political, ethical, and cultural narratives. And so in order to be able to take up this issue and thinking about it across a curatorial practice that happens through off-site exhibitions, a curatorial practice that happens through the circulation of discourse in the form of publications, or a curatorial practice that is aimed more at the pedagogical. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our panel. François Aubart, who is here from, who is here from Paris, and amongst his writing and curatorial practice, he is one of the co-founding editors of a review called Pyramid Tuning Fork Cogwheel, or at least that's my interpretation of the journal title. So, François, thank you.
Okay. So this is the title of the review, but before I start, I have to make a short introduction to say that I'm a bit confused to be the first one speaking in this panel about curating context, because what I will talk about is this magazine whose title you can see here, and of course for the making of this magazine or review, the question of public forum, of context, and how to activate a context is very crucial to us. But it's not a curatorial practice at all. I'm just stating that because last time we were in a book fair, there was this kind of a debate about is bookmaking a space for curatorial practice, and to us, the clear answer was no, given the fact that we consider ourselves editors, and we consider to deal with questions relevant to editorial practice. And this being said, the question of defining a context and dealing with a specific context and working within this specific context, being logistical or economical, is very important, and that's around this idea that I'm going to try to present this review. So it's a project we made with 5 persons, me and 4 others. 2 of them, Jérôme Dupérat and Camille Pajar, are art historians, and 2 of them, Colline Sunier and Charles Mazet, are a graphic designer. And the 5 of us wanted to create a review. We had this shared idea to make a review. And the first thing we thought about, we didn't want the issues to be thematics. We saw this project as a collection of texts because the problem when you do thematic issues, and we had a project before which was thematically organized, it's always frustrating because once you've printed the magazine, you find a new text which is absolutely essential and you've missed your job. So we organized this project around this idea of collection of texts around several interests we have, and with this idea that the magazine is like a collection of folders, and every issue completes the previous one, and a text in issue 4 can answer to issues 2, etc., etc. So to quote it roughly, the few ideas we had in mind were graphic design as a practice and also as a tool to transmit information, the question of transmitting tool, I don't know if it sounds, if it's mean anything. In French we said outil de diffusion, but I don't know exactly, broadcasting tools maybe. We had also a shared interest in music and popular culture, and the question of how history is written and how do you write history, and these obscure things and this horrible term which is artist text. We have interested in that, although we don't like the name. And of course, these few questions are also expanded along the meeting we do and the people we meet and the discussion we have. So this is not a closed door, but it was the starting idea. And to make clear this idea that one issue relate to the other one, in the first issue, this is a summary of first issue, we had a few entries with the name of an author. In this case, it's Raphaël Pirenne and Élodie Royer and Johan Gourmel, which are followed by Ed. And this Ed means in this issue, they would make a selection of documents that are reprinted in the first issue. So this is a piece of a reprint of a magazine from the 70s called Radical Software, and a piece of reprint of a book by The Play, which is a Japanese art group from the 60s, 70s. So in issue 1, you had those documentation, and in issue 2, you would find proper texts by Raphael or by Élodie and Johan about the specific issue raised by those documents. So you would find the text by Raphaël Pirenne and the one by Élodie and Johan. So this was, of course, a way to show clearly that one issue is not a finished labor. It will always complete it. And we in fourth issue, we added a picture of a performance by The Play. So on all the 4 issues, you would find traces of the practice of those Japanese artists. We also did a few things with question of text. In issue 1, I wrote a text about a mixtape by DJ Food, which was mainly based on a book by Paul Morley, which is called World and Music, which is a great, very great book on bootleg in music. And we of course, this book is untranslated in French, so we decided we would translate pieces of it under the form of a feuilleton, which means this is issue 2 and this is issue 3. So it's the same idea, one idea after the other, the things get completed, and you get a bit more of information. And of course, this is very explicit examples, but the whole magazine and the whole text are based on this idea to complete a question or complete a debate from one another. So to illustrate this idea we had to make a magazine in the form of a collection of texts, we needed a great title, and a great title is always difficult to find. So we thought we were 5, and at 5 we couldn't find a great title. So we asked an artist whose name is Benjamin Serror, who is someone who is very used in telling stories and having stories that complete themselves one after the other. So we thought this person should be a great person to make up a title. And we went to see him with this idea that maybe he would make a sentence that will develop one after the other, which of course was a very, very bad idea. And he came up with this idea that the name of the name of the magazine should be 3 symbols, and every issue, on the cover of every issue would appear the 3 symbols, And on the second page, you would have a text written by Benjamin, re-examining and redefining what is the meaning of those symbols. So the cover itself and the project linked to the cover itself raised the question of when the definition of something is completely closed and every issue it gets reopened. And also it was very interesting for us to work with Benjamin, because he finally became kind of the spokesman for this magazine, and every launch party we make, he is the one presenting the review. For issue 1, he made a concert stating that there are more and more magazines about music, but very few music about magazines. So this is for the title. Roughly, the question of economy was very important, because we were just the 5 of us, and how do you make up a magazine when you are just 5 persons that want to make a magazine? Luckily enough, Colin and Charles had a machine called a risography, which allowed to make good quality prints, and which allow us to gather around this machine. So the printing moment is also the meeting moments and the moment where we discuss what's coming next. And it was linked to this idea that we would work horizontally, meaning we would all share the task, as you can see on this picture. To make it clear, in the colophon, our 5 name appears with conception, realization, and production, which means, of course, Colin and Charles are graphic designer. Of course, we are art historian or critics, but on this project, we are on the same level. So printing with the risography is not that much, but is not so much expensive, but it costs money, and of course, we pay authors, which we found quite important. So we had to find money. And to find money, we thought we would make commercials or ads or publicity, call it the way you want. But there was one thing we were clear on what we wanted to do with that. It was the fact that we wanted to keep the control over the graphic appearance of the magazine. And so we came up with this idea to make publicity in the form of business cards, like you can see here. So these are business cards of institutions that gave us money, and under the form of stamps. And of course, it was also related to this idea that people that would put an ad in a magazine whose name you can't even pronounce don't do it for being seen or whatever. They do it really much as a support, and to emphasize this idea that these structures or these institutions help us. We thought we couldn't do anything else than to give to the reader their cards. I don't know if this is any clear, but we address the reader with the card or the stamps of the people that found us. So this, basically, that's how the three first issues appears. And after 3 issues, we had to recognize one fact is the whole world is not speaking French, which we never thought about that in the first place. And we were stuck with the fact that, one, we publish text in French, and second, as being printed in risography, we can only afford to print 500 copies, which is not that much and very limited in question of diffusion. So we thought we should find a new way of working, or at least to renew the way we work. And this is the part when I'm gonna reveal the forthcoming project, because it's a discussion we've been having for a long time, and it's still completely imprecise to us, but I'm gonna try to make it a bit clear. The idea is we're gonna do a website, and we have this fantasy of what we call the fantastic tool. The fantastic tool is something that will allow us to have exchange back and forth with the authors, as we did for the previous issues, meaning that for every issue, the text, the author defines the length of the text they want to do, and we discuss with them, etc., etc. And the fantastic tool will help us in the fact that once the text will be finished, it will be directly online and directly graphically designed. And this is to keep up with this idea of horizontality, of us working on the same level. And on the other hand, we'll keep up with this interest we have in bookmaking or in paper, with what we have been doing a lot, which is reprinting an available document. And we will start with the reprint of 1 or 2 books by the play, which is also a way to keep up with this idea that the project keeps on growing. So this is more or less for the future of Pyramide, Diapason, Roucranté. And issues 2 and 3 you can find at Art Métropole. Issue 1 is out of print, and issue 2 will be soon too, so hurry up.
Thank you, François. I wanted to actually thank Diane. I'm happy your phone rang, because I forgot. No, I'm not drawing you out intentionally. I'm doing it as a service to me, because I meant to introduce when I started the panel that we want to actually call upon our brass bell from last night and really try to keep us on the requested time. Now, of course, this seems unfair to the 2 panels that are coming this afternoon, so maybe we can talk with our institutions and our artists about that later. But I just wanted to, what we're going to do is we are going to ring a bell at 8 minutes, not 7, just to try and balance things out so you're not kept to the 7 minutes so that we can keep things moving. So apologies that I've become a disciplinarian. I would like to, I want to introduce you to Mélanie Bouteloup, who is the director of Bétonsalon, Centre for Art and Research, and whose guest-curated exhibition, Something More Than a Succession of Notes, just opened this week at Justina Barnaky Gallery.
So hi, so I'm really sorry I don't have images, so I hope what I will say will entertain you. So I'm a co-founder and the director of Bétonsalon, which is an art and research center based in Paris. And I actually founded the space 10 years ago. And I just wanted to come back maybe and say a few words about 2003, since Isabelle was talking about this period. And we were a group of artists and curators, you know, like friends hanging around in Paris. And we actually thought that we were unsatisfied with the way culture and art was supported by this time. We found that there were too little intermediary or artist spaces in Paris. You know, you had, of course, museums, galleries, but we just had like maybe 2 or 3, you know, artist spaces. And we were also we found that the official narratives in the way also art history was being taught was a bit problematic. I mean, I studied at the School of the Louvre, and I thought that the approach of art history was too much based, on objects for their aesthetic qualities, and that the influences, the cultures, the context was not enough explored, actually. So we decided to organize ourselves and to create a space so that we could actually work, experiment, show other artists. Many of them were really young. They were coming out of the art school. And year by year, the project evolved, and we opened a new space in a university in 2007. And we became, let's say, an institution funded by the state, the city of Paris, and the region. So it took some time. We worked for the first years, as volunteers. And actually, we are now in a period in which we actually have more money. So the question of the crisis, actually, we didn't really see the difference. Luckily, we could have more and more funding and support, but of course, we don't have, what we should have, I think. And the space is actually striving to develop a space of reflection on key issues of, let's say, society. We are trying now to have a program which is very often exploring problems that we think are not enough discussed in Paris or in France, and we will try to gather around these issues different people, so they could be artists, of course, but also researchers, and so we are trying to use a lot researchers who are working in the university around us. And we also try to mix, like amateurs, professionals, different disciplines, and we experiment a lot of different formats. We did a lot of workshops. We have a program now of 3 and 4 or 4 exhibitions a year. A series of seminars, workshops inside the curriculum of the university. And the one thing I should actually say is that we don't receive any support from the university. So this is also very important to mention, because here, when I introduce my space, everybody is telling me, oh, okay, so you are Bétonsalon from University Paris 7. And actually, we have no relation with them except the fact that we are in their walls. And I can really develop the program I want. I feel really free. I just wanted to maybe talk in a few words about two recent projects have been working on. So I opened like two days ago an exhibition at the Gendai Gallery, which is called Something More Than a Succession of Notes. So I encourage you to go and visit it. Basically, this show is about the issue of intangible cultural heritage. As you might know, in 2003, the UNESCO funded a new definition for heritage, including gestures, rituals, songs. So thanks to this convention, actually, there has been a process to recognize some practices which are very often happening outside of the Western world. And the problem of this also phenomenon of patrimonialization is how can you actually record and represent a culture, a practice that is actually in permanent movement. A ritual is never the same. You have many factors that can determine his way to be realized, and you can't reduce it to a single object or to a text. And the exhibition is trying actually to reflect on this impossibility to record an event or a ritual, a cultural intangible practice, in an exhaustive way or objective way. So it's better to assume a subjectivity, a partial approach, and to maybe develop, you know, also a way to approach them in by mixing different voices. And of course, this is a big issue today for museums, to try to actually, you know, change their way of working and presenting objects. So this is a big issue, and I hope the exhibition is actually, you know, asking questions more than, you know, solving the problem, because this would be like impossible. So the main, our main ambition for Bétonsalon is really like to develop a space where actually questions can be raised and discussed, and where different positions can actually confront each other, where actually you could have in one exhibition two contradictory positions. And I think this is really important to have such spaces where confrontatory and opposite positions can actually enter into dialogue. So yesterday I started to talk about a new project that I'm working on at the moment. It is a project with the French artist Éric Baudelaire. So Éric Baudelaire is actually making films, and he decided to make a film about this country, Abkhazia. I don't know who know actually about Abkhazia here. Okay. Yeah, very few people, only two, I saw only three hands. So it's a state which actually doesn't exist in Georgia. The Abkhazian people seceded from Georgia in the beginning of the 90s. They wanted to have their own independence, and there was a war, and today the problem is really, it's already, oh my God, okay. And so,
take 4 minutes.
Yeah. So the project is about actually trying to present this complex issue of what is a state and what constitutes a state. Is it something that include, exclude? Who has the legitimacy to actually define a state? And how can we actually maybe reinvent a state? So it's a huge, huge topic, and we will try to explore it with these films that will be shown in the space, and a series of roundtables happening every week, you know, involving some students, some teachers, some philosophers, and also we are trying to bring Maxime Vingia, so we hope we will get a visa for him, so that he will be able to be in the space, you know, and become an ambassador of Abkhazia and talk about his country, you know, with the visitors of Bétonsalon. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mélanie. I'd now like to invite Chris Lee, or Maiko Tanaka and Chris Lee, who are on the programming committee and curators of Model Minority at Gendai Gallery.
Start.
You start.
So, Model Minority is a screening and workshop program motivated by several desires. On the one hand, it is a long-term program that is a new mode for Gendai, which slows down the frequency of our activities but does not reduce their intensity. Financial limitations and austerity have mandated this. We adapt and enjoy the creative problems it presents, but also resent the obligation to maneuver around economic givens. Gendai continues its programming and curatorial activities in a nomadic manner. Like we mentioned yesterday, the destabilized functioning of Gendai has opened up an opportunity to re-examine its purpose as a cultural organization and the way that it operates. It's not always consciously, but of course, upon occasional reflection, we've observed that 1, the organization is taking a new form internally. There's a sense of an emergent quasi-collective/board/programming committee of volunteers coordinated by a part-time staff member, and also that there is a mode of itinerant programming with multiple temporary partnerships and different programming projects led by different members, taking turns to share the work of programming in general. Because we are itinerant, our activities, our collaborations, and partnerships and the spaces that we visit and the furniture that we borrow become constitutive of us as an organization. The character of Gendai's activities has taken something of the form of a Frankenstein. I'll skip that part. The two of us have taken on programming Model Minority, which is a project that casts Gendai's presence in the art ecology as just such a figure. And I think Maiko will talk a little bit more about the definition or how we understand the idea of model minority. And also retroactively constitutes the cultural space of Canadian state multiculturalism as the context of concern. In other words, Model Minority is a program that has the intention of highlighting and problematizing this context and Gendai's place within it and as a facet of it.
So, what is a model minority? It's a term that describes an ethnic group largely accepted by the so-called majority through obtaining relevant success in achieving the promise of a better life that comes with integration. Cast as typically hardworking, diligent, and agreeable, the model minority controversially erases difference and sets up racial hierarchies with those considered as not living up to the model. The representative model differs depending on place and changes over time. In North American countries, the model minority has been typically cast to include those of the East and South Asian diaspora. As our mayor, Rob Ford, expressed in 2008, those Oriental people work like dogs. They sleep beside their machines. I'm telling you, the Oriental people, they're slowly taking over. This quote harkens back to racist terminology of yellow peril, used during the suppression of Chinese immigration to Canada in the 1880s, as they were flooding in to work on the Canadian National Railways, with the implementation of the Chinese head tax. It also affirms what social work professor Gordon Palm observed in how the model minority discourse is inseparable from a neoliberal ideology that discounts the impact of racism on one hand and promotes fiscal self-reliance on the other. There are three distinct ways we've been confronting these histories and material realities that implicate ourselves in the discourse: public screenings, workshops, and commissions. We're going to introduce what we've been doing with the first two. So.
Can you talk about this?
Yeah.
Okay. In his research, Gordon Pond also observed how the Asian model minority discourse also dovetails neatly with Canadian discourses of multicultural governmentality. Essentially, the model minority gets used as a mechanism or tactic to regulate quote-unquote unruly populations or those not considered to be of the model. It reifies a racial hierarchy that subordinates other minorities and undermines and trivializes the specificity of struggles. Could one way to counter this insidious logic be to look into and present ruptures of this stereotype? Who are the unruly Asians out there that disrupt this image? That's the right slide. So our model minority screening series is a way to get to know a little bit of these legacies, actors, and events of Asian American political activity and dissent. Just a little promo, for example, this Tuesday night we'll be screening a film called American Revolutionary by the director Grace Lee, about another Grace Lee, who you see in this image up here, Grace Lee Bucks, who is a 98-year-old lady, I believe, who has a lifelong history of activism with the black auto workers in Detroit and at some point with the Black Power movement. And I think I mentioned, but it'll be screening this Tuesday at, do you know the name of it? At the Ryerson Theater, as part of the Real Asian Film Festival. So we also screened a film called Who Killed Vincent Chin, which is a film by Christine Choi, who is a Chinese-American film director based in New York City and founder of the Third World Newsreel. It is about a Chinese-American engineer who was beaten to death in the 1980s by 2 Detroit auto workers who resented the decline of the American auto industry because of competition from Japanese automakers. They thought that Vincent was Japanese. This film examines the social, cultural, and economic factors that contributed to this incident, and itself becomes a catalyst, and the film itself had become a catalyst of the Asian American movement.
So in addition to the screenings, our workshops are imagined as productive sessions for discussing problems, questions, and materials that emerge and are generated through the program. One question that came up is the relationship of immigrants to property ownership. Borrowing again from Gordon Pond, the model minority discourse reinvents America as the land of opportunity. This is built on the basic premise of the colonial establishment of private property, to which immigrants aspire to become part of for the promise of opportunity. Conversations around land have also been brought into questions about the relationship of art spaces and gentrification. One of our most recent workshops that addressed these questions came out of our ongoing collaboration with the Chinatown Community Think Tank, a project by Elvis Choi coming out of Whippersnapper. It started as a survey action of a group of us that we made through and about the boundaries separating the neighborhoods of Chinatown, Alexander Park, and Kensington Market. The last question in our survey was a request to contribute a new question to keep the survey rolling. The survey conversations rolled into new ones and opened up new perspective, insights, and problems with a whole bunch of new questions such as what makes us see or not see a border? How are borders affirmed? In what ways are borders taken apart? Who makes borders? How are they made and legitimized? To continue the conversations, we invited people to read the survey results with us to deconstruct the survey action we did and contribute new survey questions. The questions we came up with at the reading will roll into a new survey that will be redistributed in new formats and places. Okay, so we'll tie it up. Basically, our program is basically a way to seek and problematize and intensify our understanding of this notion and to mobilize it as a starting point for a collective critical practice. To be clear, this is not a project where we research social and cultural inequalities simply to be represented in some kind of art exhibition. Rather, the aesthetic comes through every decision we make curatorially in our communications, in the presentation and distribution of our research. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris and Maiko. I now want to invite Janine Marchessault, who, in addition to teaching at York University, recently curated Landslide.
So I'm starting with the community of those who have nothing in common, which was something I introduced in the 2-minute blurb that we presented last night. So that's a concept that comes from Alfonso Lingus, and you know, it really is maybe a model for political action that helps us understand what's been introduced by the Occupy movement, which I think is revolutionary and will continue to grow, and organizations like I Don't Know More. And I really think that in Toronto, the people who have nothing in common need to get together and really oust this person from office. Okay, that's my little intervention here. Right? Because apparently it's the 905 people that elected, you know, Rob Forbes. This is the suburbs in Toronto, and but part of what I've been doing with the past couple of exhibitions is really to try to break down the boundary between the so-called outer suburbs in downtown core in Toronto. for reasons that I'll get to. But what I want to talk about just very, very briefly is the Public Access Collective, and I was really happy to hear public access included in the ecology of an art scene that Barbara presented to us so beautifully. So just very, very briefly, public access started in the late 80s. It still exists. The Public Access Collective is a group of artists, at that time graduate students and curators who decided to innovate the spaces where art itself was shown. And it came into being at a time when Toronto was redefining itself as a world-class city, and public spaces were being very quickly privatized. And so we decided that we would organize these fairly large-scale public art exhibitions inside of advertising context. So the first project was Some Uncertain Signs, on an electronic billboard sign on Yonge Street. And the second project, a year later, was The Lunatic of One Idea, which took place at the newly completed Square One Mississauga Mall. And we worked with an advertising company on a 36-monitor video wall. And the collective also was very, very committed to theory, to theorizing, and to thinking about a theory of the public space. And so we established a journal called Public that is still going strong. But Public, as I said, is very, very committed to theory. The projects, the public art interventions, or what I would like to call inhabitations, along the lines of Michel Serres' concept of the parasite, these projects really inhabited corporate spaces, were really non-dialogic projects. They were projects that didn't so much engage with the public, even though they did take place in public, as they did sort of engage with the discourse of the art scene. And they mirrored projects that were going on in New York and in London. But there was a shift, I think, that happened in the history of the collective's public art projects in 2000, when we got a Canada Council Millennium Grant to stage a site-specific exhibition at Central Technical High School in Toronto. And that involved about a dozen artists coming into the high school and working with the kids at a time when the then conservative provincial government was executing tremendous cuts into all of the art curriculum throughout the high schools in the province. And so that project really was geared towards working with high school students, drawing attention to the importance of an art education, but also to thinking about time, technology, and intergenerational discourse. And so a young Kelly Mark was part of the exhibition, and Michael Snow was also part of the exhibition to kind of give us I snuck water in because I just... I guess I'm not going to go into detail about that project, but it is a project that's been largely ignored in the history of site-specific art, and I think it was a sweet project. And Akwi Enwazor visited this project and sort of said, this is actually the future of public art, which is relational art projects. I know I'm going to get gong, so I'm going to go really fast now. So cut to 2009. In terms of my own research, I've had the benefit of having a research chair for the past 10 years at York University. And so I've been able to meld some of my own research in with Public Access's ongoing curatorial projects. And Public Access has always been interested in cities and in the outer urbs of cities. And so that interest continues in the Leona Drive project, which was an exhibition that took place in Willowdale, Ontario, right close to York University, in 6 vacant bungalows that had been bought up by a developer and were essentially waiting to be demolished. The developer was waiting for a zoning application. It was also 2009, and so the developer actually didn't have a lot of cash on hand. So that gave us an opportunity to actually create a pause in the processes of development and to think about the history of these little houses that were going to disappear without a trace. And so we invited 23 artists to essentially think about the past of these houses and maybe to write a history of Toronto in terms of its developments. The great architectural historian Siegfried Gideon has said that these are these alternative histories of the city. And so working with a group of brilliant doctoral students who are also artists, practicing artists, we did a lot of archival research into the whole history of that particular little piece, a little micrological piece of Toronto. And we also looked into the history of those particular houses. I was working with my colleague Michael Prokopow at OCAD University, and so we did a lot of research on the architectural history, but also the vernacular history. Just we found out who lived in those houses, and a lot of the artists created installations with that particular history. This is became a landmark icon, the little green house by Antelieu, for the exhibition itself. And I love this piece because people in the neighborhood really claimed it as their own and ran tours, and everybody was photographed in front of it. And as an exhibition, for me, this is a really good example of creating an experimental community, because people from the downtown art scene came to it, but people in the area also came to it. And really, did I just hear that? 1 minute. All right, so cut to monster houses that replace the little houses. And I'm not going to get a chance to say very much about Landslide, which is why I think I was invited to this question period. Right, so just quickly, the Leona Drive project was fabulous. I loved working on it, but it was very much nostalgic. It was very much stuck in the past. And, you know, there is a political mission behind these projects, which is to really think about the future in the context of climate change and think about edge cities and development. And as I was saying, to link us and them, that's a terrible thing, but to link the city in terms of its suburbs. Markham is the place where our food is grown. It is the edge, it is the line where development defines itself. And so the next project took place, the landslide took place in Markham, and it took place in a heritage village. And so just quickly, why a heritage village is so fascinating, the history of heritage villages post-war period, that they grow up at a time where suburbs are coming into being and where the land itself is being completely leveled and history is disappearing. And these heritage villages serve to provide a kind of history for these anonymous spaces. So landslide itself took place inside of this heritage village, which was a very surreal kind of template. And I have a lot to say about heritage during question period. And there are many artists that participated in Landslide that are in the audience, but I will end here and continue after. Thanks.
Thank you, Janine. We now have our final speaker, Christof Migone, Director Curator of the Blackwood Gallery.
Is yours timed, or are you just going to scroll through?
It should be timed.
Okay, then you should be able to just play it.
Start it there.
And then we'll hit play for you.
Yep. Hello. I guess I'm too tall for this. These are timed, and so what I will be saying won't match the images. You'll have to pay attention to both at the same time, or neither. no in-between choices. Door to door to door. So this is a project, it's kind of a case study that takes place in Mississauga. Mississauga, for those who don't know, is a city just west of Toronto, the 6th largest city in Canada. When you fly out of Pearson Airport, you're flying out of Mississauga. And it's a city without a single artist-run center, but 2 public galleries. The Blackwood Gallery is one of those 2. There's a precursor to Door. The project's Port Credit were 2 off-site exhibitions which took place in Port Credit, Mississauga in the summers of 2009 and 2010. The first occupied the former offices of an architectural firm, and the second was staged in a condo showroom still in use as a sales center during the exhibition. That made for interesting meetings. We're already at Door here. Door brought the off-site thrust of forging links to the outside as evidence in the project's Port Credit to its logical extreme. If you cannot come to the gallery will come to you. The initial goal was to reach every single resident of Mississauga, population 704,000. So that has a kind of reference to Lucy Lepard's famous projects from the late 60s, early 70s. Needless to say, the goal was not reached, but completion in that sense was not the principal purpose. Rather, it was the staging of one-to-one encounters and exchanges. The curatorial premise of Door was unabashedly utopic. It engaged frontally with the implicit article of faith that art can act as a force of engagement, a conversation trigger, a tool for creative reflection. In this case, there was no naive presumption that reception would always be positive or that we would be welcomed. The encounter is not fetishized here. As the title suggests, the project's Port Credit placed an accent on the proposal or propositional stage of a work, what might or could happen. In other words, the focus was on change, plans for change. Door, on the other hand, shifted the question to one of exchange. In his classic ethnographic study, The Gift, Marcel Mauss summarized the practice of gift exchange as one containing, quote, 3 obligations: to give, to receive, to reciprocate, unquote. The set of rules in the case of Door were less rigid and regulated. With this particular frame, the economy that was applied required no reciprocity, nor even reception. It was the gesture of giving that was exhibited. The rest was beyond our control. As for the process of working with the invited artist, myriad questions arise as soon as the tangible aspects of realization are considered. If someone answers the door once knocked, is the art shown, heard, given, or performed? Or is there art to be left at the unknocked door? If so, how many objects at each door, and how many objects total? What if the gift is refused? These questions are largely alien in a traditional exhibition. The givens of an exhibition have vanished. This is outreach, literally, a reaching out. The choice of dispersal activity becomes integral to the artwork. Questions for the participating artists become: delivery by car, on foot, by mail? How are the addresses selected? Is it a day-long dérive or a week of 6 a.m. wake-up calls? Is an object given or just shown? Is it in an upscale neighborhood or at a strip mall? Is it everyone whose last name starts with P or every blue door? Are you presenting yourself as a Jehovah's Witness, an encyclopedia peddler, or blatantly and transparently a contemporary artist? Or is the doorbell rung and you promptly run? Arising from this adventure are a multitude of ethical and legal questions. We acknowledge them not as hindrances, but as fascinating encapsulations of the societal conditions which regulate exchange. The aim is not to endanger, but to astonish, albeit in an intimate and furtive manner. Door heeded part of Ryan O'Doherty's call in the very last sentence of his gallery as a gesture essay, which read, quote, "Or the gallery itself could be removed and relocated to another place," unquote. Here, the gesture goes further. It is no longer off-site, but siteless. Or it could be said that it invokes the gallery's site every time that the artist shows up at the door and knocks on the door or rings the bell. A curatorial premise that is simultaneously curious and quaint, even neighborly. Door is an exhibition home delivery service, accumulation of instant sights, an exhibition of moments. We are dislocating the gallery through a spatial and temporal splintering process. It is here and there and there and there. Mapping projects by artists abound. As well, the street is often sought as a venue, for it is perceived as a context where the public is at its most random and least contrived. DoortoDoor belongs to both of these lineages, but investigates the specificity of where public space meets private domicile. The audience is no longer the passer-by, but the resident, the occupant, the one who answers the door. What you've been seeing on the screen are how the 12 artists responded to this prompt. Divergences from the curatorial premise I just outlined were inevitable, even welcomed. The premise was not intended prescriptively, but as a point of departure, as a generative trigger. So here's a truncated summary of what you've been seeing, and we'll see how far I get. Jermaine Coe and Gordon Hicks, a pair of doors in two different buildings connected through the internet, so that when someone opens one door, the other door follows the same action, like a ghosting. Camilla Singh, a cheerleader performing a routine along to a hip-hop tune on the jukebox, intended to provide encouragement to people at their place of work. Alexander Irving, a series of plaques with quotations by various sources, Einstein, Sontag, etc. The content is matched to the location. For example, conflict cannot survive without your participation was placed at a paintball place. Mac Alexier, a two-sided page of cryptic marks in the Mississauga News revealed themselves to be an intelligible, self-explanatory text when the page is held to the light. John Marriott, that's my end, a piece of driftwood is sent unboxed through the mail to persons who responded to a flyer. So I'll skip the rest, unfortunately, but just some last words. When the grant report for this project was due, I entered incalculable in the place on the form that asked for the audience number. The grant officer emailed me back saying that it was all well and good, but she needed an actual number because she has to respond to answer to other people. So I submitted the official audited circulation number of the Mississauga News, which was just Mike Alexis's project. So I put in 150,000, which our small gallery on a suburban campus would take years to reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Christof. I think this fascinating panel has revealed to us a number of different curatorial tactics and strategies. Among them include opening and closing, broadcasting, transmitting, dispersing, problematizing, integrating, refusing integration, staging, dislocating, and asking questions. And so I think with those strategies in mind, maybe we can open it to the floor to ask questions, because I really appreciate, Mélanie, the importance of asking questions, and hopefully questions that create more questions. So do we have any questions? We have mic runners, I believe.
I'll ask a question.
Who?
Me, I'll ask a question.
Andrew.
I was waiting, but I'll have lots of questions. So I'm curious for anybody to respond. Obviously, it came up in the discussion about landslide, that you went and engaged with the museum, right, as that heritage institution or structure. And obviously, in my current role, I'm very interested in creative engagements with these kinds of institutions. So to give you more time, as you wanted to, I'll ask a question to give you more time to talk a bit more about landslide and that engagement.
Is that it? Thank you. But other people can jump in. But I had never worked with a museum before, and the funny thing is I've been giving talks now to other museums, and everybody is like, well, so what's your next project? And I'm like, well, probably not with a museum. They're like, why not? It was a difficult collaboration in some ways, but Kathy Malloy, who's the director of the museum, had recently been hired, and the museum was in the process of redefining its mandate. But it's a heritage museum, but it's a weird heritage museum. Robert Everett Green called it a data museum because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so when the current director arrived, she got rid of Heritage Village because all of the buildings are from different eras. It doesn't hold together at all. It's like a mishmash of stuff. So that was good for us because they weren't stuck on preserving this, on a preservation mandate. And they also did let us go into the buildings and do stuff. And some of the artists are here who worked in the buildings. So, Adrian Blackwell put a tent on one of the buildings on the harness shop, and Alison Mitchell put cobwebs on heritage paper, and they ended up really loosening up. I think it took a lot of courage on their part to allow us. It was hard. I mean, it was also a 2-year project, so we spent about 1.5 years gaining trust. And then it was really only about the month before the exhibition that they allowed us in to do what we were going to do. And then they did let go completely, which was a terrifying thing because they were no longer around, and we brought in our own volunteers, and we sort of took over the museum. And then, then one is terrified of deaths, and, because those are old buildings. And there's, there was no there wasn't a lot of electricity. We brought in a whole nighttime iteration, but it was still very dark. Anybody that came at night knows how dark it was. So that was frightening. But it was a very, I said difficult at first, but it was very, very, very exciting. And I know that will change the mandate. That's what the director wanted. She really wanted to be able, she wanted to do stuff around sustainability, around the future. Also, Markham is the most diverse municipality in Canada. It's over 65% East and South Asian population, and the Heritage Village is 100 years of white Quaker history with no Aboriginal artifacts. So it was great. I mean, we had 6 Indigenous artists that came in and to various degrees messed things up.
So I have a second question out of that, which opens up to all of you who presented, because in certain ways you all touched on issues about the persistence of history. You're all engaging with different narratives, different dominant narratives. So I'm again coming back to these structures or models of telling stories, telling histories. I'm curious if somebody would like to engage the idea of the stubbornness of history, or the stubbornness of the institution. I'm guessing I'm sort of looking to you to look back over here and comment about the challenge of the historic institution. And that's both a museum or policy or whatever. So it's very open, but it's like just trying to draw back out those conversations that people were introducing in their presentations. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay, well, it's very stubborn, and I'm just going to have a short, sorry. But no, a number of artists really introduced an alternate, well, I call it augmented history, that it's not, and I didn't even see it as a historical intervention. It was an augmentation in history, is bringing in different kinds of stories. Maria Hupfield went into the archive and made objects and inserted them. It's 80,000 artifacts in this archive. It's a brand new building, 3 years old, and but the objects were all fairly homogenous or from a fairly unified community, and so she really intervened there, or augmented. But I don't know if it's going to change that history altogether. I don't know. I mean, they also, Jeff Thomas asked to see all of the Indigenous artifacts, and we did find a whole collection of amazing postcards, which ended up being part of the exhibition. And I asked the museum, are you going to do more with this collection? Because it's actually incredible and fascinating. And there's a fear almost of going, even though there's a desire to change the mandate, I think there's there's a fear. Maybe you can explain that to me. But also, Markham is a very, very, very conservative new city. And so people in those institutions are quite worried about their jobs. I mean, the guy that was in charge of culture, John Ryerson, who got us into the museum and really did some fantastic things, not over this project, but lost his job just like that over other things. And so I think there's a fear of shaking things up. And, I was amazed they took on Landslide, but I had done a whole presentation to the municipal council and kind of did, sold it a little bit. But anyway.
François, I'm wondering if you wanted to respond to this question of history, because I'm thinking about how you talked about, you asked the question of how do you write history, but then I think if I understood correctly, you were also raising the question or problematizing the idea of, this perception we have of a review, a journal, a book as kind of closing down knowledge or completing knowledge, and how do you open that back up through different kinds of publishing strategies or the selection process of editing? Or maybe you don't even want to respond to those questions.
I'm going to try anyway. No, I mentioned the fact that the question of how and why an story is written was a concern to our magazine. So we did publish several texts related to the... Oh, wow, great. Okay. Can I get a picture of that? We did publish a few texts linked to that specific question. So there is one text. To take the same example, there is one text about the play, which is an artist group which really is an artist group that has been rediscovered, and what does it mean to be rediscovered? There was also a text about Parasite Group, which was a group in the 80s in New York, which history has never been written. So basically in its content, this question is also very present. And of course, this process of, instead of thematizing and preferring a layering of text and answer, permit us on a methodological point to not be closing down history or topics or whatever question we raised, but to have this question evolving in terms of what answer we can give it. And that was and still is a very important point to us, to keep the question open and to keep it important enough to come back to it.
I have a question for Christof. The project Door. I think it's really interesting, and the premise of it. But failure is somehow scripted into the project, and I don't mean that in a negative way. But also, I found the way it works is it's kind of like pushing an unwilling actor onto a stage, and there's a lot of intimidation, not like in regards to from the curator to the artist, but also people showing up at your door. So there's 3 levels of people being intimidated: the curator, the artist, and then also the audience. I just wanted to know what your expectations were of the project and whether or not the failure or its success was successful, and if it has another second life from what you've done in the past.
Well, I hope it has a second life, and in a sense, a lot of those projects were pretty invisible. I had an audience of maybe 1 at best. For example, Gina Badger's project was called Tegamami Crescent, referencing, it was a series of postcards sent to the people at that address, and I think there was only a handful of people at that address. It's a small crescent, and it was a history relating or accounting the fact that the word tegemami references, it's an indigenous word, but it's not, it's in the wrong place. It's not in Mississauga. So there was that kind of dissonance that she wanted to address. But in response to your question, that challenge, I mean, there is a curatorial failure in a sense that not one of the projects involved the artist knocking at the door. So that never happened. I mean, there were projects that arrived through the mail at the door. So and that's why I wanted to point out that the divergences between the artist projects and the initial premise. And the projects took 2 years to evolve, or I mean, they happened over the period of 2 years. From their first iteration, each project was always a pair of artists for 1 week. And in that span of time, I was in a conversation with quite a few artists, other artists as well, to see what kind of projects they would propose that would respond to the curatorial premise. And I don't think that's unusual, but I think in this case there was many instances of negotiations between the artists and myself of how we shifted from the concept to what's feasible, because of the fact that this was a siteless project and all those parameters we had to take account. For instance, Adam David Brown's project with the balloons, he wanted them to be released in the air, but that's actually against a city bylaw, and environmentally it's not recommended. So we didn't do that. We had to, and that took many months to adapt itself to the form that it took, and it was these were pictures at the Living Arts Centre. So that's a roundabout way of answering your question. So failure is definitely accepted. I used to teach a course on failure. Failure is my friend.
I also have to make a confession in that, I mean, we were in dialogue and I found the project so paralyzing that I had to pull out because it was such an impossible task at the time. But it's really nice to see the results of other people's, yeah.
Maybe your project is in your pulling out or in your paralysis.
I just wanted to point out you can get biodegradable balloons, just so you know.
Well, we did find some literature on that, and there was some commentary on the fact that they're not actually biodegradable. It's just a marketing ploy.
A quick question to Christof, too. On when galleries usually do outreach programs, it's usually to pull people back in again. So why, or what was the response from people that found driftwood in their mailbox and that found postcards outlining the history of their street? Did anyone then contact the gallery and speak to you?
The main exchanges we had were with Karen Craven's project, Apartment Hunting, where she found ads on Craigslist, for instance, advertising apartments that were placed in Mississauga or located in Mississauga and had pictures. And she would draw a kind of abstracted version of those pictures and send them back to the occupant. And we got quite a few emails of people responding saying, "This is very creepy. I'm getting a drawing of my kitchen. How do you are you stalking me?" And then we had responses by people, responses from the artists saying, "No, this is an artist project sponsored by the Blackwood Gallery." And then people were relieved. And there was one person who said, "Oh, I just moved in. I'm going to put this picture on the wall," which is a great response.
Is a question from the audience?
Hi.
Do you still have a moment? Yeah, okay. My name is Marilyn Jung, and I'm the president of the board for Gendai Gallery, and my question is directed to Michael and Chris. And first of all, I do have to apologize because I missed your presentation. But the question is related back to where Andrew started in regards to institutions and the direction of contemporary art, and specifically with Gendai Gallery. Can you both speak to, just perhaps briefly, on, for reason, Okay. Can you speak briefly about why we left the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre?
Why? Yeah, we didn't mention actually in the intro that Gendai started at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre. It was founded, there was a group of people in the late 90s who were senior artists, designers, architects, educators who were testing out the feasibility of a culturally diverse art organization in a cultural community center. And that's how Gendai came to be in 2000. There's a lot, this is difficult. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we left. It's a cultural center, so they have a lot of different kinds of mandates, and one of the ones that's privileged there is heritage, and heritage of looking back at histories. We're looking at histories too, but in a very commemorative way that we found a little bit paralyzing, I guess. And also, we didn't feel a lot of support. There was a lot of competition for the use of the space because even though it was founded as the new Japanese Cultural Center at Don Mills in Eglinton was being built, so it was constituted at the same time as the building, like legally, it meant like we had free rent of this huge space, even though the founding board were part of designing that architecture for that space. So there's a weirdness because that's prime real estate. They rent out a lot of space in those buildings. Like there's martial arts classes and calligraphy and all these kinds of things. So there's also another kind of art community, of course, there, which is the Japanese Canadian art community, professionals, amateurs, and there was a little bit of tension about the things that we were presenting because we were not always presenting the work of people from those backgrounds. So we wanted to also be a little bit more central because it was really hard to get up there for people from the Toronto art community. I don't know, lots of reasons. The reason why we don't have a space now is not because we left there. We had a space in between then and what we have now, which is an office. But that's another story, I guess.
But I think it's an interesting question how you're responding to it, Maiko, when you and Chris were describing one of the many kind of intentions or aims of the model minority is to look into, present, and disrupt stereotypical images and representations, and perhaps you can't do that while standing still, so maybe not being in one site is helpful to you. I wanted to take up one very difficult aspect of what everybody in this room does, which is how do we measure success, the quantitative and qualitative kind of measurements of success which granting reports require of us. And it's funny because Kim, Lisa, and I were talking about, do we need to have our arts councils in the room today to be talking about or talking with us about a lot of what we're exploring. And so I'm wondering with these kinds of projects, that challenge of measuring success, especially for instance, with Model Minority, it's a project that immediately recognizes requires slowness, not a kind of reduction in intensity, but a slowness in terms of frequency. You have a project that's being dispersed to a population over a number of years in different forms. So how do we measure and qualitatively and quantitatively, or how might we begin to propose new forms of measurement that challenge questions of success that I think these projects present to us as a really important task or problem? So does anybody want to respond to those kind of challenges of how do we measure what we do and its efficacy? Should we? Other than to keep getting the money?
I think that we were in a symposium a while back that was talking, introduced the notion from an economist of that a no-growth economy, and I think that that some of what the grant reporting forms, if I recall them, I don't specifically do them anymore. I've gone to another ring of hell, university administration, but it seems to me that one of the things that they were really, that they are constantly, they quantify everything, and audience numbers of events and numbers of everything that have to be presented. And I think that in some ways it should be, certain things have slowed down. Magazines often now don't have the same number of issues because the revenues are down. That performances, maybe there aren't as many as there were before. Maybe there are 2 dance performances in a season where maybe there were more before. And I'm just, I haven't really thought about that, but I'm wondering if we wouldn't be entering into the kind of, slow art movement in a way, where you don't have to have more events and more things to do if you're doing them with more depth, which is somewhat, I think, Chris and Maiko were talking about some of that. And I think it's been a number of presentations have talked about that. More isn't necessarily better. So